Hello, my name is Melanie Waxman, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD experts presentation titled Regret and Resolve: How Women with ADHD Can Transform the Challenges of a Late Diagnosis. Middle-aged women with ADHD face all of the typical challenges of aging: declining health, family concerns, career stresses, tough decisions about moving or downsizing, plus a wide range of ADHD-related complications. They feel like they don't get anything done, but they've been busy all day, but they have nothing to show for it. They report living in disorder and chaos, feeling socially isolated, and feeling vulnerable, among other difficulties. In today's webinar, we'll learn more about the lived experiences and stories of women who were diagnosed with ADHD later in life and how they overcame these challenges. These accounts are based on our webinar presenters' interviews with dozens of women with ADHD, all age 60 and older. And leading today's presentation, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Kathleen Nadeau. Dr. Nadeau earned her degree from the University of Florida, where she worked with Dr. Paul Satz, one of the early pioneers in understanding the newly developing field of learning disorders. She is the author or co-author of 13 books related to ADHD and is a frequent lecturer both nationally and internationally. Her first major publication in the mid-1990s was A Comprehensive Guide to ADHD in Adults: Research, Diagnosis, and Treatment. Since that time, she has written a best-selling book for children with ADHD titled Learning to Slow Down and Pay Attention, as well as books on ADHD for teens and college students, for adults in the workplace, and for adults with ADHD. In 1999, she shared the Chad Hall of Fame Award with her co-author, Dr. Patricia Quinn, for the groundbreaking work on advancing the understanding of girls and women with ADHD. She is the founder and clinical director of the Chesapeake Center Attention, Learning, and Behavioral Health, one of the largest private ADHD specialty clinics in the US. And before I hand over the microphone to Dr. Nadeau, I have just a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned into the live webinar may download the slides now by clicking on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. And if you are interested in the certificate of attendance option, look for instructions in the email you'll receive around an hour after today's live broadcast. If you are listening in replay or podcast mode, visit ADDitudemag.com and search podcast 392 to access the slides, the webinar replay, and the certificate of attendance option. And if you support the work we're doing here at ADDitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit ADDitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for ADDitude Magazine. It's great for your family or to share with a teacher or a loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Finally, the sponsor of today's webinar is Inflow. Inflow is the #1 app to help you manage your ADHD. Developed by leading clinicians, Inflow is a science-based self-help program based on the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy. You can click the link in the slide to get Inflow, or you may download Inflow now on the App Store or Google Play Store. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars, and sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Nadeau. Thank you so much for joining us today and leading us in this very important discussion, and I am going to hand it off to you.
So thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm going to try to gallop through my slides because I really think that one of the most important things I can do is respond to your questions. And I think there really need to be many, many more forums for women to talk about what this experience is. And today I'm going to focus predominantly on ADHD among older women. I am an older woman with ADHD myself, so I know whereof I speak. And lots of people in my family have ADHD, so I'm not just talking about this from a clinical perspective, but from a personal perspective as well. I've been in the field for many decades, And I have learned an enormous amount over those decades. And the thing I want to emphasize today is that the more we learn, the more we understand that this thing we call ADHD is not really about attention. Attention certainly has something to do with it, but it's not a deficit of attention. In fact, as most of you probably know, we also have this wonderful superpower called hyperfocus. So I would say it's more a dysregulated attentional system. It's not an attention deficit. But what I really want to emphasize and help women understand is that it's one of the most complex disorders, and anybody that thinks it's about attention and wants to just prescribe a pill for it really is way behind the times and doesn't know what's going on. Women in particular have many, many comorbidities, coexisting issues related to ADHD, and those comorbidities usually kick in right around our menstrual cycle when we're 12 or 13. That's one of the most common ages now today for girls to be diagnosed. So that's one thing we need to keep in mind is we're hugely impacted by hormones. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So this is just a list of not all, but some of the comorbidities, just so everyone understands. It has to do with anxiety, social anxiety, generalized anxiety, has to do with mood, bipolar disorder, eating disorders, substance use disorders, sensory processing disorder, you name it. There are so many conditions. And that's really one of the reasons I started my specialty clinic, is that it requires a specialization. It's such a complex disorder. And sadly, Dr. David Goodman, some of you may have heard him talk over the years. He's on the faculty at Johns Hopkins, talks about the terrible job that most psychiatric programs have in training their doctors, that if they get half a day on ADHD during their 3 years of training, they've gotten a lot. And yet it is, according to Dr. Goodman, one of the top 4 adult psychiatric disorders. So we've got a lot more work to do. What's so important for you as women listening to me is to understand that ADHD impacts every aspect of our life. So it's a real misunderstanding that you should only worry about it at work or only worry about it at school. It impacts our daily functioning in every respect. And one way to summarize it is that this thing we now call adulting is much harder to do when you have ADHD. And of course, as adults, we have all kinds of things to manage all day, every day. The thing I want to emphasize in today's brief talk is that ADHD impacts women differently than men. First of all, hormonal fluctuations. There's a reason why girls start to be diagnosed as they enter puberty. Our attention and our mood and our anxiety levels are hugely impacted by our estrogen levels. Females are wired differently. We are wired to socially connect. And that means that the social difficulties that a lot of us have as women with ADHD are much more painful and impact us much more strongly than the majority of men report feeling impacted by social issues. Females are more likely to experience anxiety and depression in conjunction with their ADHD. We're more likely to be overlooked and misdiagnosed. The most common diagnosis that women have received before getting an accurate ADHD diagnosis is depression. So, estrogen levels in menopause, we are an enormous need for research about this. And I'm assuming that many of the women that are listening today have gone through menopause. Perimenopause, and that's the point at which our estrogen levels just begin to slowly drop, is on average around age 39. And on average, at age 50, we go through actual menopause, being defined as having no menstrual cycle for at least a year. And during that 11-year period, our hormone levels are slowly dropping. And what a lot of physicians don't seem to realize is it's not the absolute level of our estrogen that impacts us so much as the fact that the levels are changing that has such an impact on our cognition and our mood. So, how are we impacted differently? I'm always talking about the context in which we live. And I don't think we're paying nearly enough attention to the context in which women with ADHD live. It's more burdensome for us because, in spite of all these years of fighting for gender equality, women's lib, as we used to call it a generation or two ago, it is still, all the research shows that women continue to be the primary parent and the primary household manager. These are both jobs that are very ADHD unfriendly. I'm sure a lot of you have heard Sari Solden talk a lot about this, that our brains in ways are particularly ill-suited to these tasks of managing a household and raising children because we have to provide all the structure when in fact what we need is to have structure around us. On top of that, surprise, surprise, most of us need to work full time. And as we're working, women are more likely to be relegated to positions at work, which are kind of like the positions we're in at home. We're very often relegated to jobs managing other people, managing their email, managing their paperwork, managing their schedule, when that's exactly what we struggle with and need help with. So we're living in a very ADD unfriendly social context. Women are more likely to be divorced. My old friend Art Robbins started talking about this a long time ago. He's done a lot of writing and research on couples. And what he found is that men are much less tolerant of having a wife with ADHD. Guess what? Because she has trouble fulfilling those standard female roles of managing the kids in the household. Women tend to be more tolerant of husbands with ADHD and therefore are less likely to become divorced. So we have this term ego dystonic, ego syntonic, meaning that it either fits with who you are or is contrary to who you are. And ADHD is ego dystonic for females, meaning that the very things that the world expects us to be good at, we're having trouble doing. Self-control, social skills, conforming to social norms, having good executive functioning skills. You know, all those roles we used to be relegated to, housewife, teacher, nurse, those are all organizational, executive functioning roles, which are super hard for us. So ADHD makes us feel like we're bad at being female, at least bad at being the role that we're relegated to. I have a wonderful 12-year-old granddaughter with whom I have fascinating conversations, and she has two best friends who have declared that they are gender neutral. And they have changed their names to declare to the world that they're gender neutral. And she explained that they're doing this because they don't want to be expected to act like girls. They want to be able to act like themselves. I think we're raising a whole new generation that's going to have a very different take on ADHD than the generation that we all grew up in. So let's talk for a minute, and I'm not going to read all of these to you because I understand that you're going to be given a copy of this slide set. But what causes women later in life to seek an ADHD diagnosis? And it's really what you might imagine. ADHD, awareness of ADHD is so common in the culture now. There's so many programs, books, articles. I was having problems with clutter, and I went to a class about getting rid of clutter, and then I started thinking I might have ADHD. I was in therapy for depression, and my sister gave me a book on ADHD. What I found, interestingly, not surprisingly, is when I compared how men came to a diagnosis later in life versus women. For women, it was networking. My daughter, my sister, my good friend thought I might have it and gave me a book, suggested I watch something. For men, it was much more, I read an article or I saw something on TV. Again, the very different connection to our social networks. Here's a good one. I was a nurse and I did well for many years in ER nursing. What some of you may not know is that ADHD is much more common in emergency medicine because it's immediate and engaging and engrossing. She was an ER nurse. Then she was transferred to a desk job, lots of tedious little executive functioning skills, and she got fired. That's when she sought an ADHD diagnosis. My daughter was diagnosed and she encouraged me. So, how do women respond after they get a late diagnosis? I want to say something about the title of this talk because I find that regret is certainly a reaction that many of the women that I talked to experienced. But I would say for many more, it was relief. Now I finally understand what the heck's been going on all these years. One woman was very tearful and regretful about her ADHD diagnosis because it had directly led to a divorce after many years of marriage. And her husband was very outspoken about why he was finally leaving. You're too emotional, you're too messy, you're too impulsive. I mean, he was describing her ADHD. However, she had never been diagnosed or treated at that point. And she had lots of regret later. If only I'd known, if only I had gotten treatment, maybe I still would be happily married. But I wouldn't say she was the typical woman. I would say for so many women, it was enlightening. It was fascinating. It helped them understand themselves and how they wanted to be in the world. So I felt re-energized in a very positive way. Another woman I really got a kick out of said, I kind of enjoy and embrace my ADHD now that I understand it. Some people might have a problem with the way I am, but I don't have a problem with it. And that gets back to my granddaughter. My granddaughter both has ADHD and is dyslexic. She was telling me about interacting in her classroom. And of course, she struggles with reading. And she said, I'm not embarrassed at all. I just tell my friends I've got dyslexia. That's why. I think we have really succeeded in the generation coming up now that they're accepting themselves and understanding themselves at a much earlier age. Now that I have ADHD, I read about it a lot and I'm learning how to reduce the challenges. Very important. I now understand that all my struggles with time management and organization were not character flaws. Remember the old book, You Mean I'm Not Lazy, Stupid, or Crazy? That came out, oh gosh, at least 25 years ago. That's what we were led to believe we were way back then. I see a lot of marriages now in which ADHD is just understood and accepted by both partners later in life. More about this to come. I have much better self-esteem. Isn't that wonderful? I try not to schedule too much in any given day. We're becoming more realistic. We're not setting ourselves up for failure now that we know what we're dealing with. So let me share with you some of the findings I have. For those of you who don't know, I've interviewed about 75 women age 60 and over with ADHD, many of whom were diagnosed late in life, some of whom were diagnosed in middle age. Um, so one very interesting fact is I saw a pattern, one that we're all familiar with, of young women, older teenagers actually, with ADHD having a great likelihood for impulsive, unplanned sexual interactions leading to impulsive, unplanned pregnancies. So if you are vulnerable at that point, you're more likely to have a child than a girl without ADHD. But what I found, which is very interesting, is in the women I interviewed that didn't get pregnant as a teenager, that went to college, that finished college, there was a much higher number of them that intentionally remained childless. I don't think anybody has written about this, and I think we need to do a lot more research. I think that for the majority of them, they wisely thought, I just can't do that all. It would be overwhelming for me. And so I'm not going to have children. Parenting challenges are intense and often just overwhelming. I mean, as all of you I'm sure have read, it's if you don't have ADHD, it can be very challenging to raise a child with ADHD. And think about it, when you do have ADHD, you've got the emotional dysregulation, you've got the difficulty with organization and planning. And so women with ADHD are much more likely to get divorced than are men. Not much more, but more likely to get divorced. Therefore, they're becoming single parents raising children with ADHD. Talk about an incredible challenge. So our experiences are different as women. The impact of ADHD is intergenerational, and I bet I am not telling you anything you don't already know. Here is a story that really illustrates it vividly. A woman that I'll call Irene raised two daughters, one of whom had very severe ADHD. She became pregnant when she was 18. She was into drugs. She had a very unregulated life. Her mother and her older sister took care of the baby for this very impulsive 18-year-old. And actually, her older sister tried to adopt the baby, but the younger sister wouldn't allow it. Meanwhile, she was completely unable to care for the child herself. So this grandchild is now a teenager, wants nothing to do with her mother. Her grandmother and aunt have been involved for the past 16 years in raising her. And they're still dealing with her very dysregulated mother who has refused to finally admit she's really not able to raise this child. So this is a painful illustration of how ADHD impacts and can impact generation after generation. A lot of women report to me that they mask their ADHD at work, which takes an enormous amount of effort and energy. I'm always talking about bandwidth. How much bandwidth do we have? How many balls can we successfully keep in the air at the same time? And so many women tell me that nobody on my job would ever suspect that I have ADHD. However, I have nothing left. My bandwidth is all used up by the time I get home, and I would never allow anybody in my front door. I don't cook. We live on carry out. I can't keep the house straight. Things are utterly chaotic at home, and yet somehow I pull myself together and arrive at work and am able to function there. That's a very exhausting way to live, and it's exhausting to feel that you have to hide how hard it is to struggle with all this. women that I talked to almost universally had financial struggles. And by that, I mean that those of whom told me that they were financially comfortable, it was in almost every single case the result of having a spouse without ADHD who'd had a successful career, a successful business. Almost all women said, I'm just bad at managing money. I don't have a budget. I don't have savings. I tend to purchase things impulsively. I'm not good at it, which is another major life stressor that we live with. This is a very positive finding, and that is that among the women that I interviewed, there were quite a few long, very positive, emotionally supportive marriages. However, they were all second, and in some cases, third marriages. In other words, they made very different choices the second or third time around, and almost universally described their spouse as patient, supportive, easygoing, tolerant of their still present ADHD, very, very different from the first person that they married at a young age. So I am going to talk about the biggest ADHD struggles that were reported by older women. And I imagine most of you are going to be able to relate very well to these struggles. So the very first one, and one that was shared by men and women alike, is in retirement, once the structure of work life is over, once there's very little structure around them during the day, that their biggest struggle is, I cannot seem to get anything done. I've got the whole day ahead of me, and I feel as if I've been busy all day long. And yet, at the end of the day, I haven't accomplished half the things, or maybe even any of the things that I set out to accomplish in the morning. And so they're talking about problems with procrastination. Oh, I cannot bear to go in and clean out that closet. I know I've been meaning to do it for the past month. I can't get to it. Poor self-discipline, just setting a schedule and doing it, often just retreating into avoidance. And that avoidance is usually spending a lot of time watching Netflix, a lot of time online, on social media, just anything except getting up and managing the daily chores. Reported a lot of trouble just getting started on a task. The old joke about there's no round to it here. I don't have a round to it. A lack of motivation and difficulty staying on task. And I'll tell you, and I've been specializing in ADHD for decades. And of course, I pay attention in my own life to the things I try to teach the people that I've worked with in therapy. And yet I consciously need to talk to myself, and I'm consciously going around the house picking up things because I like a tidy environment, but I'm not naturally tidy. And so I'm always going through a room. Oh, I left the coffee mug there. Oh, there's my phone. I've been looking for it. Oh, I didn't hang up my jacket. I meant to when I came in the door. That all these years, it's still a conscious effort, but one well worth making to lead a more orderly life. And I look at my two granddaughters with ADHD, and as you know, kids have lots of other things on their mind than keeping their home environment tidy. And I was exactly the same way when I was their age. So I don't get frustrated with them, but it doesn't come easily. And I think we really need to recognize what is it that we need to get the things done that we truly want to get done. And are we giving ourselves a task list which is not really self-motivated, but motivated by what we think we ought to do in the course of a day. I asked lots of women that I interviewed about entertaining at home. Do you entertain at home? If so, how often? And one response I thought was hilarious. Do you entertain at home? And the response was, not if I can help it. And I think that's wonderful that women are now feeling that I have the right to not try to live up to that standard that was set 2, 3, an infinity of generations ago, that our role is to manage the home and to take care of everyone else in the process. And I think the generation of young women growing up now are going to be able to comfortably set their own agenda. Second greatest challenge is just my emotions are not under control. This is something we've only really started talking about as a fundamental aspect of ADHD, I would say, in the past several years. And we've been talking about ADHD for a long, long time. And we're finally recognizing that emotional dysregulation is not some other diagnosis. It's not because we have borderline personality disorder. It's not because of anxiety. It's because we have ADHD. And if I were going to summarize what I now think of as ADHD, I would say it's a disorder of self-regulation, that we have difficulty regulating ourselves. And that means regulating our emotions, regulating our attention, what we're paying attention to, when we're paying attention to it, regulating our time, regulating our tasks, regulating our environment, that all of that is challenging for us. And I think it's so important to understand that this is a natural part of ADHD, and then begin to develop the skills to have more comfortable self-regulation. And that has to do with really understanding what is stressing me out. What are the pressures I'm under that are causing me to lose emotional control, to become so frustrated, so angry that my emotions are dysregulated. And obviously, these older women that responded are still finding difficulty with that, just becoming much more easily frustrated or upset than they wish they did. Time issues, classic. And yet, these are not the issues. If you look at the diagnostic criteria, these are not the things that are emphasized. So tremendous difficulty setting a routine and then maintaining it. And that has to do with lack of structure. A lot of times I say to older adults with ADHD, you may be more comfortable living in an environment such as some kind of a senior living environment that provides some structure for you, where there are meal times, where there are scheduled activities, where you don't have to create all of that structure for you. Some of you may have heard of the villages. It's the fastest growing area in the country. It's a series of suburban communities, all in combination, called the Villages in Central Florida, and it's exploding. And I think it's exploding because it really reduces the complications of life. I actually know a couple of people who live there, and they live there very happily because there are so many activities, so many chances for social encounters, and they don't have to create any of them. All they have to do is show up. It's in some ways really kind of an ideal environment for somebody with ADHD. It's almost like summer camp for grownups. So But most of us don't live in situations like that. And so many of the adults that I talked to, I was concerned about because their sense of time and their regulation of time was so off that they were staying up until 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, sleeping until very late in the morning, and just getting out of a rhythm of when do I get out and exercise? When do I eat? When do I spend time with other people? When do I focus on accomplishing things? That life just became very, very blurry for them. Um, One woman that I worked with, I was so concerned about, and she had actually been a very functional, hardworking woman with ADHD, had raised two daughters on her own. She had been a teacher, and then she retired and moved close to her older daughter. And that's when her life began to disintegrate because she lost all the structure that the workday had provided. And her daughter brought her to me saying, "My mother has never unpacked. The walls of her apartment are lined with unpacked boxes. She stays up half the night. She's living on cheese and crackers. She's not planning meals. She's not getting out. I'm very, very worried about her." And she lost really all sense of time when the structure went away. Remnants of hyperactivity. This one kind of surprised me. You know, we always talk about hyperactivity lessening as we get older, and the real physical hyperactivity certainly does lessen with age. But this was something brought up by the people that I interviewed, that even though they may not look hyperactive if you're just observing them, that there was a constant feeling of restlessness. I can't just sit and watch TV. I have to be doing something, have to maybe be doing two things at once, like I'm knitting and I'm looking at social media online while I'm watching Netflix. Talked about hyperactive brains, and this really impacts us, especially when we're trying to go to sleep. I find that that is one of the ways that my own hyperactivity certainly manifests to this day. And that's one of the reasons why many of us have difficulty falling asleep. There's just way too much going on in our brains. And it's not necessarily worries or anxiety, it's just lots of thoughts. And one of the things I do and recommend that my clients do is give yourself something to focus on. You'll be much better able to fall asleep. I think that's why a lot of people fall asleep in front of the television, which is not something I recommend. I would like people to be comfortable in their bed in a dark room, not asleep on the couch with the lights on. But what I suggest is to listen quietly to a podcast. And if you are sharing a bedroom with a partner, then I use an earbud, a wireless earbud, to listen to a podcast. And I can go very peacefully to sleep in 15 or at most 20 minutes if I've got something else to focus on. Talking too much, that's certainly the way hyperactivity is commonly manifested in us women, and it continues in our older years as well. Feel I just can't relax. I've got to keep going. I've got to keep doing, and taking on way too many things. This is something I have tried to be so conscious of. I can't tell you, and I'm sure many of you have had the same experience of just getting all excited about some new project. It's almost spring. I'm going to buy all these flowers and plant them in my yard. And then I bring them home, and then I don't have time to plant them. And then I forget to water them. And you know how that story goes. Buying lots of bulbs. You can tell I'm a gardener in the fall, and then not ever getting around to planting those 200 bulbs that I very ambitiously purchased and never seemed to get planted. So I am learning in my later years to be a lot more conscious of, okay, let's buy a little flat of flowers and get those in the ground. And if I'm still feeling ambitious, I can always go buy some more, learning to moderate. And the fifth greatest challenge, and this is a really big one for us women, and I want to talk about it in the context of how do we help ourselves. And that has to do with people issues, feeling misunderstood, feeling judged by other women, women recognizing I need to be a better listener. I've got so many thoughts going on in my head. I'm having trouble listening to you, or I'm just waiting for you to stop talking so I can say the thing that's on my mind. Using the wrong tone of voice and realizing maybe I was too loud, or maybe I was a little too critical and I've offended someone without meaning to. Saying the wrong thing unintentionally. I just blurted it out, a form of impulsivity. And missing social cues, being so busy talking that we have trouble paying attention to, am I talking too much? Am I boring the person? Are they wanting to say something and I don't pick up on the cue that I should stop talking now? And all of those lead to difficulties with other people. So this gets me to something that there's an enormous need for, and that is support groups among women with ADHD. And I'm going to stop in 3 or 4 minutes so I can take your questions, but I'd like to tell you about a support group that I led during the pandemic for 15 months with my colleague, Dr. Susan Van Oost, who is also my age. And my clinic offered a whole range of free online support groups at the beginning of the pandemic to provide support to the community. And of all the many, we offered 11 different support groups. And the one that kept going the longest was a support group for older adults with ADHD. And as you might imagine, it really was a group for older women with ADHD. Over the 15 months that we met, I had one man that came for months but rarely said anything, and another man that came once or twice and never came back. Clearly wasn't meeting their needs. But I can tell you that those women became so close to each other, so supportive of each other. And they were all expressing, this is the first time in my life I feel safe, that people understand if I'm interrupting, that I don't mean to take over the conversation, and I can just apologize and they'll say, don't worry, it's fine, and we go on. And those women found the group to be so meaningful that they have continued meeting without myself and Dr. Van Oost. And I would love to find a way to support the creation of a network of such online groups. I think that's one of the blessings of COVID, is that we've all become so comfortable being online and connected online that it would be very easy to set up such support groups online, but much more difficult logistically to set them up in person. And I think that this kind of social connection and social acceptance is one of the most healing experiences that we can have as a woman with ADHD. And for many of them, the first time they've ever felt that way in their lives. Years ago, I ran an in-person small group. We were 6 women with ADHD over a lunch hour. These were working women who rushed to my office, and we met and once a week, and they bonded so closely. They actually started organizing mutual dig outs of one another's houses and would come in and tell hilarious stories about who, qualified as having the biggest mess. So they found acceptance and camaraderie and validation that they'd never experienced in their life. And I don't think enough has been written or talked about at all about how much we need that as women with ADHD. And I'm going to stop there and take your questions for the next 15 minutes. And again, I am delighted to be here, and I'll look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nadeau. That was a wonderful presentation, and I'm going to dive right into the questions. We got some really great ones, and thank you, participants, for submitting them. But first, I just want to thank our Inflow sponsor again for sponsoring today's webinar. So, Dr. Nadeau, one question that came in multiple ways that I would be interested to hear your thoughts on is that, what do you say to a woman who is, for example, one woman who wrote in said she was 79 years old, but she decided not to get an ADHD diagnosis for various reasons, even though she thinks she has it. And then there was another woman who was diagnosed at 42.
Okay, I'm just looking at the question box and not sure.
Oh, that's okay. I combined a couple of questions
right
together.
now.
So.
First one is, how do I manage my sleeping ADHD with nightmares, confusion, looking for things, fighting with others? At night, while I'm trying to sleep, my ADHD symptoms are exhibited tenfold in my dreams. So I guess I'm trying to understand the question clearly, that these are things you're dreaming about, feeling confused, looking for things, fighting with others. Obviously, many of us dream about things that we are worrying about. I don't, while sleep problems in general are very commonly reported, I wouldn't say that reporting ADHD nightmares are commonly reported to me. That's not been my experience. But I would say whoever sent me this question is clearly struggling terribly about how to manage her ADHD and how overwhelming it is, and that these issues need to be addressed during her waking hours. How can you affirm yourself? How can you feel comfortable with yourself and not require yourself to do all the things that you and maybe others around you are expecting you to do? I keep referencing my 12-year-old granddaughter because she is a wise soul. And she told me the other day that she had decided when she grows up, she is going to have a very simple life. She said, I don't think I want a house. I think I want to live in an apartment, and I want to find a way to work from home, and I want a very simple life. And I think she already has a lot of wisdom about how she'll be able to function at her best. And so many of us are functioning with a set of decisions that we made a long, long time ago that were very bad for us. One of the women that I reference so often in my lectures is a woman who came to me. She was about 30 years old, and she had 5 children under the age of 5. She had 2 sets of twins and a singleton in between the 2 sets of twins. And clearly, these were decisions that were made very impulsively without plans. And she had created a situation in which she was in a permanent state of overwhelm. And what I'm always advising people is we need to talk about the environment that you're living in, and how can you find or create an environment that is much more supportive of what you need. So I'm saying that the nightmares when you're asleep have to do with the feelings of being out of control when you're awake. And I hope you're able to find someone that can help you create a more supportive environment in which to live. Here's another question. I'm 73 and I just figured this out. Why life puzzles me. Where can I get a book of tips to help me clear off a space on my kitchen table, something I've been working on for many decades? I've never had someone in for dinner. Wow, that's a very clear illustration of what you're struggling with. And I think that what we need as people with ADHD is simplicity, and what we often create as people with ADHD is way too much complexity. And that has to do with not looking before we leap, doing things impulsively, taking on things impulsively. I'm always reading organizing tips and tools. And just the other night, I was reading online, and this didn't have anything to do with ADHD. It was how to live happily in a small apartment. And the professional organizer was talking about what to have and what not to have on your kitchen counters, and to only have things on your kitchen counter that you use every single day. And anything else should be stored away. Our brains are calmed by simplicity. Our brains are calmed by order. A lot of studies have been done in the workplace showing that people are more productive if they have a clear desk rather than being surrounded by notes and papers and reminders. And so there's no one magic book. There are many books out there. One book, even though I am the co-author of it, that I can highly recommend is called ADD Friendly Ways to Organize Your Life. It came out a lot of years ago. I still think it's a very good book. There are countless other books that have been written for people with ADHD about organizing.
Dr. Nadeau.
Okay, I see we have about 10 minutes left, 8 minutes left. And do we have any more questions?
Dr. Nadeau, if I'm able to ask, what do you say about a husband and a wife who have ADHD? You mentioned so much about the marital problems that can happen when the wife has ADHD. What about if both partners?
I'm sure that lots of you do have questions. Don't be shy about asking them. If you don't have any questions, I've done an amazing job of explaining how we're impacted by ADHD.
Unknown caller.
Any other questions about
Dr. Nadeau, can you hear me? Are you able to hear me?
Okay. Apparently there are questions, and somehow.
I just had one question that really resonated with a lot of our readers. Our viewers. I'm so used to talking about the web and the magazine. What do you say to two people who have ADHD and are married or partners? How does that, you mentioned a lot about marital problems when the wife has or partner has ADHD, but what happens when both of them have it?
Well, that's a very good question. And I have seen such marriages go in two very opposite directions. Sometimes they live a very happy partnership. They totally get each other. They have similar values, similar tendencies, and are not critical of each other. That's the positive outcome. But I've also seen that the challenges of ADHD can be doubled. And in that sense, I've seen couples that are explosive, both emotionally reactive, both making impulsive decisions, both spending too much money and blaming each other for it. So it can go in either direction. And I think some of it depends on temperament. I've worked with several couples that did beautifully, that both had ADHD, that were of calmer temperaments and more artistic and really supported each other in leading a creatively disorganized life.
Thank you so much for that. And also, one question that kept reappearing was, how important is it to get a diagnosis later in life? We had one viewer who wrote in that she was 79 and she was sure she has ADHD, but she, for various reasons, did not intend to get a diagnosis. And then there was one woman who wrote in that she recently got diagnosed and she is now seeing the same symptoms in her mother, who is 73, and how important is it for her to get a diagnosis? So I would love to hear your thoughts on that later in life diagnosis and how important it is.
Well, I think it's very important. A lot of people think, why should I get diagnosed if I don't want to take medication? So the first issue, and it's a big, long one, William Dodson has done a lot of talking for ADDitude and in other places too. I'm a big fan of Dr. Dodson, and he has talked about the risks of not being treated for ADHD are not taken into account, and the risks of taking stimulant medication as an older adult are exaggerated. Everybody has different health conditions, but almost all of the adults that I interviewed said they had really significantly benefited from stimulant medication. However, that is certainly not the only treatment by far, and should never be the only treatment for ADHD. And just suspecting you have it is a very different place from knowing you have it and seeking out treatment, identifying what are the challenges in my life and how can I meet them? How can I create a life that is more functional, more comfortable, more satisfying for myself? And there are a lot of ways that you can learn from each other, as I talked about, the importance of forming groups, but also working with coaches and psychotherapists to really pinpoint what your struggles are. There's no point in life where you're just too old and it doesn't matter. And I hope nobody listening feels that way about their life.
And that kind of goes into my second part of this question. How can a woman advocate for herself when her healthcare provider either diagnoses her with something like just anxiety or just depression or another disorder, or just kind of, brushes away the suggestion of ADHD? Are there any tips that you can provide for that individual?
Absolutely. That kind of thing happens all the time. First of all, don't stay with a doctor that dismisses what you're saying. There's so much information out there about ADHD. And if you have family members with ADHD, if you have experienced the same struggles, you almost certainly have ADHD as well. It's highly genetic. And that's one of the ways I really emphasize getting a diagnosis as an older person. If you've got grown children with it, grandchildren with it, much more likely that that's what's going on with you. One of the things, I run a specialty clinic, a big specialty clinic, and a lot of people come to one of our psychologists, psychiatrists for a diagnosis and recommendation that they then take back to their provider at home, because I think they feel much more comfortable making the diagnosis and treating the disorder if an expert has made the diagnosis.
And Dr. Nadeau, you had mentioned earlier about how stimulant use is appropriate for older individuals, and that some of the narrative around that isn't necessarily true. But we did get a lot of questions about women who are postmenopausal or just well past menopause. And I'm curious, how do stimulants work for those individuals? Is it less? And how do the symptoms of ADHD manifest in women who are postmenopausal or past menopause?
There really is not a significant difference, and it's so important to understand. And again, I'm not a physician, and I defer to William Dodson, who is a physician, has treated many, many older adults. But his position, which I completely agree with, is that psychiatrists in particular and physicians in general are not trained whatsoever in prescribing stimulants to older adults, and they wrongly assume that medication complications or cardiac risks are much greater than they actually are. I certainly recommend that people get clearance from a cardiologist if there are any cardio concerns, but other than that, it is safe, and you can take it in small doses and see how you respond. And older adults respond exactly the same way that younger adults do to it. And my book that's coming out in the fall, called Still Distracted After All These Years, outlines in a lot of detail, excuse me, the responses that older adults have described. And many of them have described it as absolutely life-changing that they have started taking stimulants as an older adult.
Well, thank you so much. I know that we're all going to look forward to reading your book this fall, and we hope that you can come back and join us again. Unfortunately, we are out of time for questions, but I just wanted to thank Dr. Nadeau again for leading this enlightening and very helpful conversation and taking the time for being with ADDitude this afternoon. We enjoyed it so much and hope you can visit us again.
Good. Well, thank you so much. And I apologize for the glitch in my microphone. I'm glad we got reconnected.
Yes, absolutely. And we also want to thank our viewers as well for joining us today. We hope that you will register and join us for more ADDitude webinars. And we also want to thank Inflow just for providing their sponsorship today, and also let you know that the next webinar we have is called ADHD. It's basically on how ADHD affects communication and strategies to improve it. And that is going to be with Dr. Mart Burton. And if you enjoyed today's presentation, be sure to check out our future ADDitude webinars and our articles and research updates by signing up to receive our free email newsletters at additudemag.com/newsletters. Thank you again, Dr. Nadeau, and thank you, viewers. We hope to see everyone soon. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.